and I'm the Managing Executive for Client Coverage for ABSA Corporate and Investment Bank. Thank you very much for joining us here this evening. We really appreciate your time, especially given that it's the graveyard shift. So apologize and apologies to the panelists, but also a huge thank you to the panelists for making the slot. This session is being live streamed, so thank you to those that are streaming right now as well from all over Africa and indeed various parts of the world as well. So first of all, ABSA Group is delighted to partner with the African Development Bank on this particular initiative for bringing a real thought-provoking and interactive panel discussion on the occasion of the AFDB annual meetings. First of all, a quick introduction to ABSA. For those of you that don't know us, I'll be surprised if you don't, but you know, we are African. We are a Pan-African regional bank with global connectivity, present in 15 countries around the world, but 12 in Africa. In most of these countries, we are systemic and in the top 3 in terms of presence in those various countries. In total, we have about 34,000 employees on the continent, and in most countries been there for more than 100 years. So for today's discussion, we aim to facilitate a frank discussion that acknowledges the challenges faced by the continent, but really with an ambition to achieve a just transition. So we're looking really for a solutionist mindset that captures the role of the private and public sector to catalyze our green transition in Africa. So climate-induced shocks really, is the biggest threat to this continent, and mobilizing alternate funding is an economic imperative and requires an urgent call to action. We heard in the opening session yesterday that Africa is only responsible for 3% of all the carbon emissions around the world, but is the hardest impacted from a global warming perspective. So we invite you to participate this evening with a solutioning mindset, but really focusing on creating opportunities for growth in Africa and helping us overcome those limitations and challenges faced in the various sectors within which we are trying to drive on the continent. So once again, thank you to the panelists and to you, the audience, as well, for making the time. So I'll hand over to Msizi Khoza, who's the head of our ESG business in the CIB side of our business at ABSA. Over to you, Msizi. Thank you.
You've taken my notes.
Oops, your notes.
It would have made this job extremely difficult if I don't have any notes to. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Msizi Khoza from the ABSA Group. With me on stage are financial sector leaders across the continent, and we're hoping that in the next hour we're going to pick your brains and get some really rich insights and thoughts and ideas around really how can we really mobilize domestic and international private capital to bridge the gap. So over the next hour, we're going to also explore some of the challenges and the opportunities and really look at how do we boost public-private collaboration in this effort to unlock and accelerate green investments across the continent. So with me is Ms. Boitumelo Mosaka, the Chief Executive Officer of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, Mr. Rami Eldokani, the Executive Chairman of the Egyptian Exchange, Mr. Xavier Chibia, the Chief Executive for ABSA Regional Operations at the ABSA Group, as well as Mr. Ahmed Atut, Vice President of Financial Sector Development here at the African Development Bank. Thank you, gents and lady, for joining us this evening. Look, we're convening tonight at this beautiful resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh against the backdrop of a heightened and increasingly urgent imperative to address the climate question. Africans are most at risk and most impacted by extreme climate events. The studies show that in the absence of strong climate action, Africa stands to lose between 2 and 12% of GDP by the year 2050, depending on global warming scenarios. So climate action is inherently an economic issue, which means it's a people and a human development issue at the core. According to the UN, the gap is widening between demand and supply. Africa will need about $133 billion in clean energy investment to meet its climate goals by the year 2030. And investments in renewable energy, arguably perhaps the most attractive sector, stands today at a mere $9.4 billion. And this has not been helped by the fact that in recent times, financing conditions have become tighter. The fiscal position of many African governments has come under severe stress. Public debt as a share of GDP reached 54% in sub-Saharan Africa in 2022, the highest level since the early 2000s, driven by the COVID-19 pandemic, stickier and higher inflation, geopolitical tensions, rising interest rates, currency depreciation, the list goes on. And in the context of this limited fiscal space, private sector has got a critical role to play in bridging this misalignment between the needs as well as green growth ambitions. So whilst it's a trite that climate finance mobilized by the private sector has increased globally since 2010, this landscape has remained heavily dominated by non-private actors. And it's clear that there's a mismatch between climate needs as expressed in nationally determined contributions, for an example, as well as flows. Now, oftentimes, the DFIs are seen or perceived to be the panacea of all of our problems. So perhaps then, let me start with you, my dear sister, Boitumelo. From the perspective of the DBSA, which is tasked with driving both impact, but in a financially sustainable way, I mean, what is your assessment of the challenges for DFIs to meet these demands and expectations?
Oh, there we go. Wonderful, great. Let me start by greeting everyone in the room, and a special thanks to ABSA CIB for this invitation. A little bit of background about who the DBSA is. We are a wholly owned development finance institution with a mandate to drive economic development and capacity building within the Southern Africa region. What's happening? Okay, great. And we are focused on network sectors, that is namely energy, transport, digital infrastructure, water, and two social sectors, and that is health, housing, and actually three, and education as well. As a development finance institution whose vision is to drive Africa's prosperity, it is important for us. Thank you. We live in a continent, Caesar, that is a mess with poverty, inequality. You know, coming from South Africa as the most unequal country in the world, that is not as industrialized as other nations, and yet there's an expectation for all of us to ensure that we meet climate goals. So we, as a development finance institution, it is critical for us in the markets that we operate in to remain a market maker, to assist the countries that we serve in this build-up, in achieving a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. One of the things, Msiza, that we do as an institution, we believe in the concept of a programmatic approach to solutions. A programmatic approach to solutions enables scale, it enables speed, and in addition to that is a great platform for resource mobilization. So what we have done as a DBSA, for example, we have seen the power of collaborating with government to create an enabling environment. And this we saw with the renewable program that we implemented in South Africa. And thus far, there's been more than 300 billion rand invested in that space. And all that money did not come from government. All that happened was we collaborated with our government in establishing an independent producer, power producer office, and our government worked extensively, in actually, getting the policies and the regulations right to actually get private sector to participate in this space. Interestingly enough, even when we look at the services we offer as a bank, because we plan, we prepare projects, we fund projects, we implement projects, and we also maintain. When you have that enabling environment, it is actually the private sector that takes the risk as well around project, project preparation. So we saw the success of the REAP program, and as DBSA, because we are in South Africa is an extensively unequal country, we also played a critical role in enabling inclusivity in this opportunity, by actually funding black economic empowerment companies as well. And we have seen the success of it. However, what I'd like to highlight, Msiza, is that, in all of this, there was a lost opportunity in terms of creating a whole industry, because we still import all the panels that are coming, into the country, and all the equipment as well. So I think it is important that as we embark on this green growth wave as a continent, it's important that industrialization, creating the so needed jobs in our economies, remains at the heart of the transition. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
No, thank you very Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Boitumelo, for those insights, and maybe just to pick up that point. It struck me that one of the undercurrents in these discussions at this year's annual meetings, both in the plenary but also in bilateral engagements, has been this sort of need to democratize the benefits of this transition towards the green economy, and in particular this question around the involvement of SMMEs, women, youth-owned businesses, and the like. So Xavier, if I may turn to you, I mean, in that context, what in your mind is the role of commercial banks such as ABSAs? We've got large presences across the continent in really driving, that aspect of the transition.
Thank you, Msizi, and very good question. But before I get to the question, let me also just give a bit of a brief in terms of how we see ESG, because it's quite important and provides context in terms of the discussion we are having here today. I mean, for us, in terms of just what we stand for, our purpose, building a sustainable future for this continent is absolutely crucial. And you've outlined already a good context in terms of the impact that climate change is having. You know, we see it every day. You know, you feel it in the temperature, you see what it's doing to agriculture. In some countries that are dependent on hydropower, you see in terms of just the volatility that creates in terms of generating power. And ultimately, this is just simply food security and livelihoods of people being impacted, because the most vulnerable get impacted more as we go through this journey. And therefore, as an institution, being a force for good for us is something that we take very seriously. Building a sustainable future is something we take seriously. We do this if you look at our governance, right, we have the Social Sustainability and Ethics Committee of the board that monitors in terms of the progress that we are making here and makes all the policies in terms of what we have to do. Last year, we elevated the role itself in terms of looking at this seriously at the EXCO, Group EXCO, where a Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer was appointed into the Group EXCO to drive that strategy. And if I pick the key elements in terms of our ESG strategy, you'll see that we've got three main focus areas. Operating across this continent, financial inclusion is very important. We can't lose sight of that, and that's something that we play a role in every day. Diversity and inclusion is very, very important in the focus. And of course, climate that we're discussing here today. And as we think about climate, we've got a number of commitments in terms of what we are driving there, right? We've got ambition of a net zero target or ambition by 2050. That's something that we are driving every day. The type of financing for renewable energies, we've committed 100 billion rands by 2025. And we're already way underway in terms of delivering that in supporting those sectors. But it goes beyond just financing. It is also how we engage our customers to understand the risks related to climate change and how we support them. But also how we ensure our clients also have strategies that are aligned to our own strategies to be able to deliver that. So that becomes quite important. Now, in terms of the role itself, I think one thing that goes without saying is the time we've been here, the type of financing that's required for this continent is significant. No one player can do it on their own. Therefore, to see my fellow panelists here and all the roles that they're playing, you know, it's a partnership, it's a collaborative way in which we have to deal with this. And therefore, as we look at all the different demands that are there, we believe that we have to cooperate, we have to collaborate in order to ensure that the access to finance, which will come from different sources, capital markets, you know, blended finance, concessional loans, all those things, they play a role in terms of how we land in a place where our clients will have not just access to the funding that is required, but access to funding at very affordable rates, and also ensuring that there's an environment that supports that. And that is where stakeholders, in terms of how we collaborate, not just with, say, development financial institutions, multilaterals as commercial banks, but also with the governments, so that we have an environment that supports what we were trying to do. So in a nutshell, I think we believe this is an area where everybody has to hold hands. We all have to hold hands in order to be able to deliver.
Thank you for that, Xavier. So Rami, if I maybe turn to you. So, I mean, of the total climate flows into Africa in 2020, 80% of that was from public international actors. A very small slither in the region of 4% was from the public sector, and only 14% from private actors. Now, if you just do a very simple comparative study, Yeah, that 14% is well below peer regions across the continent, across the world, whether it's Latin America or South Asia. So I'm really curious to know from you, what in your mind can be done to really deepen domestic capital pools, with the specific purpose of then using those pools of capital to finance this transition?
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me on the panel, and thank you for the survivors here in the room who made it to 6 p.m. to attend our session. Thank you for coming. It's a very good question, and capital markets is a little bit different from banking and lending. So you deal with investors, and equity providers need to have a little bit more of certainty. Green financing and sustainability financing has always been a domain where IFIs and donors and government spending is the main source of it. Investors needs return. Investors need sane investment decisions. Thus, the availability of data is quite important for our countries. On this continent, we have more than 52 countries, and unfortunately, because of the economic situation that everyone is suffering of in the room, we have seen multiple rounds of deval for our currencies. So our market caps, our collective market caps, has been getting smaller and smaller every year. So we're not actually on the radar of international investors. So we need to become, or the collective collaboration between our countries and our markets is important to come together and try to create at least some sort of Pan-African products that would shed a light on the entire continent. I'm chairing the sustainability committee of the ASEA, which is the African Security Exchanges Association. And one of the initiatives that we are pushing for in EGX is try to create an African ESG index, because we do not have an interesting ESG product in our continent. On EGX, we were almost the second or the third exchange globally that we had our ESG index with S&P late in 2010, before even the word of ESG is quite known for a lot of the scholars. However, a lot in the continent is still missing when we do that. So we need to create a collective product that would shed light to international investors. The inflows of that has been happening to ESG funds in the first quarter of this year and exceeded $29 billion US, especially in Europe, are not flooding anywhere in Africa, because there is no possible and good data for these funds to come in. So the lack of data and the lack of ESG reporting on our markets is saddening, and we need to work together on creating that. So we have a lot of, the biggest market, the share of market caps on our markets is usually banking. And banks are usually very, very well regulated, and central banks push for proper ESG disclosures and all of that. So we need to utilize and build upon that. In Egypt here, we have mandatory ESG disclosures. Effective of this year, we started receiving the mandatory disclosures. It's still the beginning of the learning curve, and still a lot has to be done. And we need to invest a lot into the learning curve and the capacity building that needs to be directed to listed companies. And it's a top-down approach. So you have to deal with the CXOs and the board level and take it down and make it part of their own presentation and roadshow presentations, where they talk to the investors how they deal with ESG challenges. Because at the end of the day, how we position ESG here in EGX, we talk to our issuers and we tell them, look, it's either a business opportunity or a business threat. So if you're not ready in a few years, you may not be able to export your products. You may not be able, if airlines may not be able to fly over Europe in a few years because of their carbon emissions. So all of these kinds of ideas, we have to start positioning it differently on the agenda of the decision makers in Africa. Doing that and getting very closely to interested private sector investors in ESG and green financing is definitely key in order to listen from. So this is one area. The second area, when we talk about more about green financing, in our part of the world, I think it's a little bit more expensive than conventional products, especially when you talk about green bonds and the structuring of that. And yet, because a lot of businesses do not understand the difference between the two products. They only compare upon prices. So they will go to a conventional product as long as it's cheaper for them, as long as it supports their cash flows better and makes everyone happy. They don't understand what's coming behind that, and definitely having a green bond would entail a little bit more investment in the housekeeping inside the institution itself and make them ready and make them go green. So they still perceive it as an extra expense with no exact return. So we need to do and to think about it a little bit differently. We cannot rely always on government imposing regulations that we need to report, we need to do that. No, it has to come from within, and understanding the value of it. We rely a lot on the financial services in our country in order to promote that. We see that we have 32 banks operating here in Egypt, almost 11 banks are listed on our exchange, and we see how the progress of their ESG reporting and how they're improving, and we try to showcase what they're doing to other sectors and to other players in the market. So it's still a learning curve. We're ahead. Africa is, yeah. So Africa is still in a very good position when it comes to green products. We can see that, especially on the carbon market space. As you said in the beginning, that only we contribute less than 4% of the global CO2 emissions. However, we still believe that carbon credits is going to be Africa's new resource, and it shouldn't be abused, and it shouldn't be sold for steep discounts as we're seeing now. There should be more collaborative measures in order to bringing or synchronizing regulations, especially when it comes to identifying carbon credits and how they can trade among the continent. So I think there is a lot of things that we need to do together. We need to collaborate, we need to come closer in order to create synchronized regulations when it comes to green financing and sustainable financing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rami, for those really powerful insights. And you touched, although somewhat very briefly, the point around the cost of capital. And this is an interesting point I'd like to double click on, because historically, such things as, or such barriers as low returns, lack of bankable projects, or subscale projects or investment opportunities, these have been oftentimes cited as the key impediments towards really unlocking green investments. So, and to me, it speaks a little bit to appetite. Yeah. So Ahmed, I'm looking at you as the head of financial sector development at the AFDB. In your experience, what is almost in the toolbox of these out-of-the-box approaches, thinking that ultimately reduce cost of capital, that crowds in that private sector investment?
No, thank you so much, and again, it's a pleasure to be on the panel with our development partners and partners when it comes to capital markets development in Africa. So, and again, thanks for those who made it at 6 p.m. to the panel. Well, I think let me give you a different perspective, maybe, and then I will end with the cost. I think we at the African Development Bank, when it comes to environment, and I think you have said it properly, that Africa is contributing only 3% to carbon emission, but at the same time, we are getting only 3% in terms of climate financing. That is around $18 billion per year, and at the same time, we are paying as Africa between 7 to 15 billion cost of climate change on a yearly basis, and this is expected to go to 50 million. So the situation is not looking that rosy, but I think it's also full of opportunities. Full of opportunities because we at the African Development Bank, we have the privilege to deal with the 54 African countries, public and private, throughout the all type of sectors. So we are at the manufacturing, we are at the water and sanitation, we are on the agriculture, we are on the financial sector, and even human capital development. So we're seeing how the market is slightly or gradually moving from the conventional type of lending to all this kind of environmentally friendly, social, green, SDG type of investments. We are seeing a steep change in the way our regional member countries are asking for alternative solution in meeting their SDG goals, in meeting their environmental requirements, and how to mitigate all this kind of green projects that are already in place and they are really growing on steadily basis. For an investor, and let me be very clear, an investor is an investor. I mean, it's important to do green projects, but it's important also to ensure that they have the right revenues, right? The right margins, the right premium. The risk appetite for Africa is a bit diminishing for obvious reasons. So our role at the African Development Bank has changed recently. So we're playing on two main pillars, and this will take me to the coast eventually. The first pillar is sensitize African institutional investors and international institutional investors on the importance of mobilizing more resources for the environmental and social type of bonds, loans, SDG-linked bonds and loans, how they can perceive the African risk when it comes to monitoring and evaluation and reporting. We all know the importance of reporting when it comes to, let's say, Western type of investors, and I think this has been happening recently. So on the knowledge and the information dissemination, awareness creation and so on, we're really playing an active role. So we're trying to change the risky perspective, which indirectly will affect the pricing and the cost of the eventual issuance. Another way that we're approaching this problem is the de-risking. So we are really active when it comes to the de-risking of sovereign and non-sovereign exposure. We have been recently engaged with the government of Benin to support them in issuing one of the very first SDG-linked bonds. Last week we approved Egypt, another sustainability bond, and very soon we'll also be working on different type of sovereign lending when it comes to, again, African countries. Why I'm saying so? I'm saying so because this is really a way that we are crowding in institutional investors at adequate pricing. Last but not least, when it comes to private sector institutions, we're also trying to leverage our balance sheet, and we are trying to chip in and put or anchor the bonds. I think many of our participants here are aware that we are working on with different institutions when it comes to the social bonds, green bonds, and so on. We recently anchored a Mauritius Commercial Bank issuance very recently, $147 million, and a big portion of these resources will be into this kind of environmental and social stuff. So just to end on the coast, I think all these elements is really to showcase that Africa is not risky. Africa risk perception is a bit inaccurate, and with this kind of investments, we are trying to shift the needle, and slowly but gradually, we will be able to crowd in more institutional investors at competitive pricing for our countries. Thank you. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. So I'd like to shift our conversation somewhat and introduce an aspect of this debate which sometimes elicits very strong emotional views. And I'm doing it on purpose, and please, you are most welcome to also ask questions as the audience, or if you've got views or questions you'd like to put to our panelists. So I'm opening the floor. So often we in this transition, and it's the aspect around the justness of the transition. And my dear sister Boitumelo, you spoke about the fact that in the South African experience, we've somewhat lost the opportunity to re-industrialize or industrialize as we've undergone this reprogram. Yeah, and oftentimes we hear political leaders talking about the need for Africa and Africans to transition own time, own pace. So I'd like you to maybe just unpack, what it means when we talk about this just transition, and how the DBSA is thinking about these vexed questions.
The just transition affects each country in a unique way, because all countries are different, and they all have their own competitive advantage in terms of playing a role in the green economy. The just transition impacts everyone. It impacts the youth, it impacts women, and as we, unpack it, and this is something that we have seen as we have, supported our clients, that it's important that because of each country's uniqueness, it is important that they actually develop a plan that suits them. That is a very, very critical thing, and a plan not only that will enable the country to just transition, but to also attain the economic growth that they expect to attain. So it is a balanced approach. It is not transitioning in the dark, if I could put it that way. It is actually transitioning in such a way that it creates economic growth within the countries. Let me give you, for instance, an example, a practical example of what we do at the DBSA in this space. We have what we call an embedded generation program, where this is a self-generation. That's where private sector generates their own power and have offtake arrangements. What we have done there, because this is another opportunity, even for the SMMEs, with the special economic zones. When we build our special economic zones as part of our Africa Free Trade Agreement, we can take from this, that self-generation and how we have done it within the DBSA contents. We did not only develop the program, but what we then also did is we mobilized the funding to then say, from all our development banks and partners, how do we then, raise funding, to then support this specific program, concessional funding, at that, where we pass on the benefit. What's going to be important is we actually cannot look at risk and rewards the same. Where you, and we saw like early days of us raising bonds, there was no price benefit. And yet when one looks at the requirements, from a reporting perspective, one still has to bear that cost. So I think there has to be a shift around, how we look at financial instruments from a just transition perspective. The issue around blended finance is important because remember with some of the countries that are actually offering these concessional funds, it's also important for them to actually look at should they be looking at a mix between concessional funding and an element of grant funding as well, so that we can actually look at a reduction in the average cost of capital within the with the just transition. So that's going to be important. Reducing the cost of capital, for these projects, it is going to be very, very critical. Thank you.
No, thanks again, Boitumelo. So you raise an interesting point, and I'm looking towards you, Xavier. I don't know whether you wanted to respond, but because oftentimes, the large commercial banks, we get quite a lot of criticism, for being too risk averse, and making it sometimes even too hard for the DFIs and some of these other partners. So I guess I just wanted to get your sense, Xavier, around how do commercial banks within that context change their approach, and if you say not, I'm going to ask you why not.
No, thanks, Mrs. I mean, Earlier on, I talked about the fact that, first of all, you've got to give yourself a target, right? So if I pick renewable energies, we said 100 billion rands by 2025. You know, we are almost, I think, about half there or so already in that journey, right? So it's happening. The issue is, of course, the demand is so much higher than any institution can supply, and why we all need to work together. So on our own, we've got our own targets in terms of how just transition should be managed, how we start building, you know, a lot of the green type of projects. You know, I've seen there's traction that we're gaining even in issuing green bonds. That's something that's new, we're learning, and we're going down that path, but that's something that's working out quite well. But if we talk about risk, let me focus where the big risk is, right, which is on the small and medium enterprises, not even the large institutions. Usually those can attract funding quite easily. So that is where I think a number of things have to fall into play. We have to be confident, because we are lending depositors money at the end of it all, right? And as we've seen everywhere in the world today, depositors can be sensitive if they believe you're not doing the right things. So we have to make sure we are doing the right things and we manage the risks appropriately. How do you manage the risks, right? You've got to have your own risk appetite, but you've got to work with other partners as well. And some of the things are basics, but it's how you do it and how you execute on them. So if you think about it, you will get more comfortable with the fact that any borrower will repay if the governance looks right, there's transparency, you understand what they're doing, how they're generating cash flow into the future, the management of that institution has got the skills or they're upskilling, and they're able to perform in whatever they're doing. And as a result of that, we've got a number of partnerships. If I use one we recently launched in Ghana. So we're working with MasterCard Foundation there. And what we've done there is so far is we've already reached out to thousands of SMEs. We've got a target, again, to finance about $100 million worth to about 5,000 SMEs in the next few years. The rates themselves that those SMEs will be borrowing will be at concessionary terms, in terms it's blended, right? There's a subsidy involved. You also have an attraction there that they don't have to put up collateral up to a certain amount. Now, that is a good example of something that we are doing in East Africa with other partners and in Southern Africa, in different countries. Because you are actually saying that there's capacity building, technical support to your clients. There is a way in which you can manage the cost of funding so that it is not as high in terms of the cost of capital, rather, to the client. And you are mitigating the risk through either credit guarantees or risk participation with another player. That helps, because what we are seeing is a lot of the partnerships that we have now with these institutions, that when it comes to green projects or even other social responsible projects in terms of, say, women in business, the risk participation is stronger, and you even have more in terms of what you can offer to help those clients. So what I'm saying is that the risk aversion and how you manage it is very important. Who you partner with to do that is very important. You can reach out to a lot of SMEs and make a difference, and we are doing it in different parts of the world. However, the reality is the demands are much higher, and therefore we have to keep doing more. And that's why we are focused on this type of partnerships to do more.
No, I think the point around demand is valid and very well made. So, just around that point, so Ahmed, if I could maybe just ask you to expand. I mean, in your experience, what more needs to be done to really drive this acceleration in the mobilization of large-scale funding?
No, thank you so much. I think partnership, as been said by ABSA, is something that we really need to do, and we are really doing. It's something very important. But we also took different type of actions at the African Development Bank. So on our side, we established the African Alliance, African Financial Alliance on Climates, and it is really an initiative that aims at increasing the mobilization of resources into just transition. We are very keen to do this kind of advisory work where trying to mobilize resources when it comes to first loss cushions, all this kind of structured finance, all the tools that we need as African financial sector players to be able to issue on attractive pricing. We have also played a different role when it comes to establishing a capital markets development trust fund only aiming at supporting the development of capital markets in West Africa. We have supported like the stock exchange in Nigeria in having this kind of green rules to issue green bonds. When it comes to the risk-based supervision in Ghana, in Nigeria, in West Africa region in general. And our role here is really to make sure that the necessary ecosystem is functioning enough to be able to accommodate this kind of activities. Is it enough? I can tell you no. But is it adequate? I can tell you yes. It is very catalytic. It's pushing, it's trying to change the way we are doing business. It will take time. We're scaling it up. It's a small fund of $10 million. It's small, but it's still sizable. Something that we're also always doing in our business, the quality at entry, is to ensure that our investments are all responsible. And I think we're all sharing the same thing. So it is something that is, if we are putting the stamp of ABSA, DBSA, FDB, PIC, all this kind of DFIs, African DFIs, I'm quite sure that the international investors will value this kind of stamp of quality. And to have the stamp, it means that you went through a due diligence process. Yes, we are doing it as part of our business, but we know that it costs money. There were some experts looking at this kind of procedures, environmental and social management safeguards, and so on. So even if we DFIs are demanding, please bear with us. It means that that you are meeting the international best practice. It means that those coming after us from UK, from Japan, from China, from wherever, will be looking at you as an institution that is doing this kind of responsible investment. So a lot has been done, and there's a lot of initiatives that we're currently working on. So please keep following us, and I'm sure, again, partnership is key. Thank you.
So just on that point, I mean, one of the really prominent themes in this gathering is how Africa can harness its vast natural capital and convert it into other forms of capital. So Rami, you mentioned a little bit earlier the point around carbon credits, and of course it gets more, a little bit more exotic. But in your mind, kind of what are the regulatory or policy constraints that are preventing this mass conversion of our natural assets into other forms of capital?
Actually, no, there's no regulatory constraints. It's a matter of fact that the lack of regulatory synchronization is what's happening now. I always say we need to regulate carbon credits on the continent before it's becoming another Bitcoin. So everyone is trading it with no regulations behind it, and no one knows what's the underlying asset behind it. And then you go into topics as is greenwashing and all of these problems. Issuing a carbon credit is a very lengthy process that would require bringing in third-party verifiers and validators on ground. You have to fly them business class from Europe or from Washington to come into a rural area in Africa to check a project and to verify and validate that this project actually contributes and gives carbon credits. It can take you up to an 18 or 24 months from the minute you start operation till you have an actual tradable instrument. And no single project can accommodate the investment cost that you have to put on day one and wait till 24 months in order to trade this project. So this is one constraint that we are trying to solve here in Egypt. We're trying to create some local validators and verifiers that follow international best practices, and in order not to miss with the pricing of the carbon credit, the need why you need this kind of verification and or the audit process, let's put it this way, because you need to maintain the proper pricing of the carbon credit. If you do not bring a proper auditor for your project, then you will not get a proper pricing for your credit. So this is one part. The second part, like here in Egypt, for example, the Financial Regulatory Authority has approved and recognized carbon credits as a tradable financial instrument, which is still not the case in many countries in Africa, or most of the countries in Africa. However, the actual trade of carbon credits is still happening over the counter, OTC, not on exchanges. You have a middleman, a broker, that actually takes up to 50–60% of the proceeds, leaving the community, the local community in Africa, with almost zero or very little proceeds of the carbon credits. Then you need to have proper exchanges in order to trade these credits. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to do in EGX, and we're trying to promote with other partners from other exchanges in Africa. We need to create an African order book. We need to create a proper liquidity for the entire continent. We need to create transparency of pricing. We need to create transparency of the projects or the underlying asset that's actually issuing the credits, because all of that would only mean the proper development of the product itself. Countries and regulators need to come together in order to synchronize these type of regulations related to carbon credits. For example, how would a credit being issued in Kenya or in South Africa could be traded on an Egyptian exchange? So the synchronization of regulations, and how South Africa recognizes this credit versus Egypt recognizes this credit. So they need to come together and synchronize all of these regulations for cross-border trades. Again, if we do not do it, it will always be there. It's still being traded over the counter, but we need to provide more transparency and more liquidity into this market.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I know that we are standing in between people and their dinner and dinner engagements. So I'm going to, in the absence of I haven't seen any hands here. Oh, there's Mohan. Go for it.
I've got a question on the carbon credits. You know, in South Africa, our CEO was speaking about how, you know, we, as a country, we've already delivered 6 gigawatts of renewable energy, another 3 coming through the pipeline, and yet none of them have taken advantage of the carbon that's been avoided through this renewable energy. So what are we missing, and what exactly? So I'm wondering, as banks and development banks, what should we be doing to kind of, it seems like it's money that we're leaving on the table that could be used to lower the cost of funding or whatever the case may be. What should we be doing for the next round of projects that are coming through?
Well, definitely you need to engage with the project developer from the beginning. There's a lot of project developers, and whether globally or on the continent, can help you with the project design and how can they bring in the verifiers and validators on day one in order to validate this project as an actual provider or an issuer of carbon credits. So you need that on your side on the first day. The second thing is definitely once you issue the carbon credits, you need to either you want to keep them or treat them as a financial instrument. So either you want to keep them till they appreciate, or you want to immediately trade them and lower the cost of capital that you're talking about. So there's always different instruments. But the first phase that you need to bundle always is to have a project developer with you in order to issue these carbon credits. He will do all the job for you. Then you need to register these carbon credits in an internationally recognized registry. There are like 3 or 4 globally recognized registries like Gold Standard, Vera, GCC. You need to register these credits into these registries. Thus, you will have the international buyers and international liquidity looking at them. So you see Total or British Petroleum looking into that, and they want to buy these credits. So you want to put them in a proper market to trade.
Any other questions from the floor? None. So I will take the liberty, given that I'm the only one standing here, to play a little thought experiment with our panelists. So if each of you were to imagine that you were the president or the ruler of a united Africa. I'm not suggesting that any of you must change your jobs.
I would gladly do.
If you were the president, my dear sister, of the African Union government, the sole president of 54 countries, what is the one thing that you would do to accelerate our green transition in a just manner?
The one thing that I would do is we have all the green minerals on the continent. So I would ensure that we have a big industrialization of all those minerals and beneficiate them before we export them.
Thank you. Rami?
Well, I would definitely think of having, creating the power from the local communities in Africa. We always look at the bigger scale and the bigger makeup projects, and for that we never go anywhere. But if we focused on providing instruments for the local communities and avail financing to the local communities, I think you're going to see change. Because at the end of the day, what you need to see in your country is proper welfare and prosperity for the people. Then you need to start with the communities, not with the bigger projects.
Thank you. Xavier?
I'm going to fail this exam because I can't say one thing, because if you are in government and you are running this continent, I'm not too sure you can do one thing because it's quite a complex continent. And but I think the support for private sector to do what they need to do is very important. Where we've seen these type of things work is, first of all, your obvious responsibility while you're elected into office when you're looking at these type of things is to attract the investment, make sure that the economic environment itself is sound. So your macroeconomic environment, when it comes to things like your stability in, or rather having at least low in inflation rate, stability in exchange rate, so that the interest rates themselves remain low, is very important. But I think it goes beyond that in terms of the policies you make to support everything in terms of investment. The institutional framework and government support is quite important. And therefore, when you talk about policies, you know, the comment was made earlier, which is rightfully so, that it's quite expensive to even invest in some of these alternative technologies, energy, all these things. Therefore, your tax framework becomes quite important. You've got to have the right tax structures that attract investment into these areas. You've got to make sure that the supporting infrastructure, social services, and skills are available themselves. And therefore, as a government, you've got responsibility to make sure those things are in place. And quite important as well, even just the overall legal framework that it is working. So those, to me, are some of the key things that will enable private sector to play their role even more effectively. So I failed the exam, Caesar. I can't say one thing, but I can just say the things that I've seen work in different parts of this continent. And I think if they were working consistently across the continent, you'd attract more investment.
Thank you. You failed the exam, but 100 A plus for effort. Ahmed?
For me, I think I will get through the exam, because for me it's very clear. It is the governance. You fix the governance, you will have the enabling environment that through it you will have the right access to finance, and then you will be able to create jobs for youth, women, and so on. So start with governance, and then everything will be automatically adjusted. Thank you.
Pass the exam. Colleagues, thank you very much for that. Brings us to the end of our session this evening. It's also A plus for you because you managed to make it through the graveyard shift. But thank you very much. I hope that you found this very useful and insightful. I certainly have. I'd just like to thank our panelists once more. Thank you very much, my dear sister and gentlemen, for indulging us and for your time. We deeply, deeply appreciate it. Let's give them a round of applause, please. And then finally, a big thank you as well to our partners at the African Development Bank. There's a big team that's behind all of this, but Blemming, you've been our main contact, so you pass on our gratitude to the rest of the team. But thank you very much, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.